The initial rebellion against Assad in 2011, by all accounts, was a continuation of the Arab uprisings, the Arab Spring. And it had economic and political reasons. Economic because of the unemployment, various reasons that every other country faced those rebellions. And the youth were motivated by such measures. Unfortunately, the intervention of other countries, both in support of Assad in terms of Iran and the support of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Gulf countries for the opposition, encouraged only the Islamists, the fundamentalists within the opposition. And gradually, as time went on, the secular opposition became more and more reduced, while Islamists not only got publicity but also got enormous funding, military equipment, money, expenditure, and so on. As a result of this, yes, there is a Syrian left, but it is in exile, it is in opposition. And its history is also has to be considered, because in terms of the Syrian government, like many other similar governments in the region, although they are secular in appearance, they are very often intolerant of left opposition. And therefore, that in itself gives rise to a growth of Islamist opposition as opposed to secular opposition of any kind, liberal or left. There's two issues here. One is that the Islamists have also had a lot more funding. And the second is that historically, and don't look at it for the last 10 years or 8 years, look at it in, say, the last 40 years, the last 50 years, Islamists haven't faced major repression. It has been an appearance that secularism is trying to stop them. But they were allowed to use the mosques, the madrasas, the teaching seminaries to develop groups, to develop their own ideas, their own organizations, and they had enormous funding. So it is not surprising that they are the political forces that appear. The surprise would have been if a left that has no funding, that is repressed more than the Islamists, would have become a major force. That would have been a shocking thing, because that wasn't the case. There is a last additional point, and that is the histories of what I would call the conventional pro-Soviet communist parties in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the 1970s. These parties played a role because they were often ruled by politics in the Soviet Union, because they followed what was the interest of the Cold War for the Soviet Union. They lost credibility because very often they seemed to associate themselves, support a dictatorial regime such as Assad the father, for example, this Bashar Assad's father. Or because of Soviet interest, they moved into opposition. But it wasn't a rational reason for the ordinary people. That was discrediting rather than anything positive. There is a left, first of all, in Lebanon, an exiled Syrian left, which is quite active in Lebanon, in France, in Britain to a certain extent. And their general statement seems to remain one of a third position, neither Assad nor the Islamists. Right? It's a small voice, it's a very small voice, but it's a genuine voice, and it should be respected. Yeah? So they are opposed to those who support the Assad regime. But they're also opposed, such as Iran, such as Russia, and so on. But they're also opposed to military intervention, because they see how Islamists are actually gaining power through the intervention as playing the victims. There is a third part to this, which is the Kurdish opposition in Syria. And it obviously has a very good history in terms of the last few years in particular. In the liberation of Kobani, in the way it set up the councils in that region, in the Kurdish region, and the way it operated in that region. There is a problem there for them as well, and that is the issue of foreign intervention. So because of the desperate situations they faced in Kobani, they could not take an anti-interventionist position when the US started intervening. And then Russia started intervening, and they couldn't take a position against that either. And in my opinion, although they maintained the support of the Kurdish population in Syria, and they will have that because they are recognized as the forces that fought both the Assad regime and the Islamists, in terms of the region, this is not a very good development. And the remnants is of the Kurds in Iraq. You cannot be partially for intervention. It is the history of colonialism and interventions that has created where we are in the Middle East. It is the history of dividing a line that went from one part of the Middle East to the other and unilaterally divided countries in the interest of France and Britain that has created these problems. These states where nationalities are mixed, where nations such as the Kurds are divided between 4 states. Because of that, it's very hard to see how another intervention can solve the problems of the Middle East. Again, one has to hope that there has to be some solution to this disaster, this humanitarian disaster, apart from anything else. The problem is there doesn't seem to be a will, an international will, to stop the Islamists getting funding or to reduce their movements across borders. And it is because of that and the divide between the partners of the UN solution. The divide is very clear. Iran and Russia want to maintain a form of the Alawites or Al-Assad regime in power in Damascus, while the US and its allies, in particular Saudi Arabia and Turkey, are determined to get rid of Assad. So we are talking of talks that will only highlight this major division. There isn't a middle road here because the Russians are the only ones talking of a middle road because they're saying we would give asylum to Assad, but at the same time accept a form of elections or whatever. The Iranians are not accepting this. So the groups that the United Nations is bringing together are going to face a major problem here. It is surprising for those of us who look at the situation from outside why there cannot be a UN-imposed sanctions on countries that do not stop funding to Islamic State, to Daesh. And that is a basic start for this process. Quite a lot of the oil monies that they gain from selling oil is transferred to accounts in Turkey, in the Persian Gulf countries, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia. In Turkey, these monies are then returned physically back to the region, back to Iraq, back to Syria. Why isn't there a will to stop that funding, to put sanctions on countries that allow both the movement of people but also movement of funds in and out? So there are many steps that can be taken, but I'm afraid I'm very skeptical about the intention.